We are going to turn now to the life and ideas of Max Weber, the German thinker and someone who is considered to be one of the foundational figures in sociology. And as with Durkheim, his ideas are controversial. This is not surprising. As I said at the beginning of the course, there's no sort of accepted orthodoxy within sociology, so people tend to just find theorists that they find compelling. I will state, though, that I have dark wonderings about whether people have actually read the work of these people. I think sometimes it's one of those ideas of I'm in this camp or I'm in that camp. But as I said at the beginning, I'm more interested in generative ideas, and on that basis, Weber is undoubtedly one of the key figures of the 20th century and the 21st century. So, I want to start out by looking at his biography a little bit, and then we're going to move into looking at some of his key concepts. I, of course, cannot cover everything in this lecture. He wrote a great deal, and a lot of it was not actually put together. A lot of it was actually edited by his wife, who we'll be talking about shortly, and only became available in English in the middle of the 20th century. In understanding the life and ideas of Max Weber, it's very important to look at the time period he's living in. And so you can see he's living right through the Industrial Revolution, many, many different revolutions and uprisings and upheaval in Europe. And he lives through the First World War. Luckily, he didn't live to see the rise of Nazism, but he certainly saw the devastation that followed the First World War. And so, like Durkheim, he, in my opinion, is a great humanist. He was extremely concerned with what was going on, not just in German society, but in society in general. And he had a very kind of visionary mind. And so he was, for my purposes, very important because he takes religion very seriously. And not in the sense of being a believer or not a believer himself. I don't know his religious beliefs or lack thereof, but he took it seriously. And so we see with Weber a sociologist who's interested in ideas and how ideas shape society and then shape individual behavior. And I hope by the end of this lecture you can see, whether you agree or not is up to you, but see the argument that he's making, that we have to be careful in sort of arguing that the shape of society completely affects the individual. Sometimes it's the other way around. And this again causes controversy. And so many writers in sociology sort of pit him against Karl Marx. I don't view it that way. I think this is a very American idea that the whole world needs to be, particularly in the 50s and 60s, the world is seen through the lens of communism versus non-communism. I don't think Weber was concerned with that. He's a thinker in his own right. He's looking at things through a very particular set of lenses that I'm going to be discussing as we go through here. So if we look at an overview of Weber's biography, he was born in Erfurt, Germany, into a prominent family of industrialists and civil servants. And as we're going to be seeing, this is important because he's actually probably his most famous work that we're going to be looking at in some detail, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He's directly, in some ways, looking at his own family. And so this is often, when you look into the history of ideas, people come up with their ideas through their own lived experience and what they're seeing around them. So this is definitely the case with Weber. His mother was a pious Protestant and his father was a lawyer. Now, these facts are important for a number of reasons, one of which is that his mother is coming out of this strict Protestant tradition that he's examining in his most famous work. So he has a deep inner experience of what that style of Protestantism is like. And his father was a very different character. And so from what I can glean of his biography, his parents were not well suited to one another. As is often the case, opposites marry or attract, and so in some ways Weber is trying to handle the friction within his own personality that develops. It's also been said that friction creates great ideas, so there's something to be said for that. He married Marianne Schnitger in 1891. I'm going to be talking about her in a minute. And he trained in law and received a PhD in 1889. What does often get glossed over in my experience is that he suffered with his mental health and had an actual breakdown and had to sort of stop working for a period of time. And I think this gets glossed over a lot of the time with great thinkers because there's so much, I think there's still so much stigma around mental illness. But there's no doubt that Weber was, from what I can tell anyway, an extremely sensitive person, and so was very aware of all the issues sort of around him and what was going on in his society and what was going on in his own family. And so I did want to mention that because I do think that aspect of his struggle gets glossed over. So the woman that marries Max Weber is Marianne Schnitger Weber, and she is important for a number of reasons. I think you can get a sense of her from this portrait. I think it's a really lovely painting, and you can get a sense of her personality. And so she happened to marry such an influential person, but she's very important in her own right, and I'll be discussing some of that. But I think it's very indicative that Weber married somebody who was his intellectual equal, and I think they were very much influencing each other and their ideas. And as I said earlier, she goes on to be the person that really puts together all his writings and ensures that it's published. In looking at the biography of Marianne Schnitger, we see that she is a German version of that new woman that I spoke about in one of the earlier lectures. And so she was born into a prosperous family in Germany, and she pursued higher education as much as a woman could at that time. As we discussed, women couldn't, in many countries, couldn't attend university. So she audited courses in economics and law at the universities of Freiburg and Heidelberg in the 1890s. And it was there that she met her second cousin, Max Weber, and they began an intellectual and romantic partnership. So Schnitger Weber was particularly interested in women's legal position, looked at the idea of patriarchal legal traditions rooted in Roman and Germanic law. She was a feminist. She was dedicated to the vote for women, or suffrage, and she wrote a number of influential works. One called "On the Evaluation of Housework and Women and Objective Culture." So, in the piece from 1912, she's taking seriously the world of women and the labor that women pursue. So she was far ahead of her time. And so she brings this analysis, still often downplayed within sociology, but that the idea of the world of women is equally important, as, for example, the public world. And then women in objective culture, she goes up against Simmel, who argued that women are intrinsically personal and men are public, and she argues against that kind of a dichotomy. So basically arguing that women aren't born biologically a certain way, they're shaped by culture. And then we can see she lives into the 50s, and so she's the first woman to be elected to the German parliament. So both she and Max Weber were extremely active politically and intellectually. So like Durkheim, Weber was intensely aware of the rapid change that his society was undergoing, and this awareness shapes all of his work that follows. He's been referred to as a nostalgic liberal. I don't think that's quite right, but I do think, like many people going through this incredibly tumultuous period, there is some hearkening back with nostalgia. And this is a constant kind of thread that moves throughout modernity in the Western world, kind of nostalgia for the medieval period and guilds and when everybody knew who they were and what their place was. And this has undoubtedly been a huge force in Western culture since the rise of the Industrial Revolution, that we have, many of us have this intense sense that we've lost something very profound in this process, and certainly Weber was part of that. So he was interested in many things. He's been called a polymath. He was interested in economics, politics, religion, among other things. I can't, of course, go into too much detail because there's, his ideas are, he's looking at many, many different aspects of human culture. And I think this is very important. Again, this gets glossed over, and one can speculate on why this would be. But he was clearly what we would now call an engaged scholar or an engaged intellectual. He was not somebody who was sitting in his velvet robe with his pen. He was directly participating in his society and trying to improve it. And so he served on the Constitutional Committee of the Weimar Republic after Germany's defeat in World War I. So he attempted to develop a sort of democratic constitution. It was rejected. That's a whole long story that leads, you could argue, into World War II. But certainly Weber was trying to imagine what this new society, the Kaiser was deposed, it's not a monarchy anymore, so what would this society in Germany look like? And again, this is probably where the dichotomy between communism and Weber comes, because there was a very strong communist movement in Germany at this time, and so he would have been opposed to them. That is accurate. As I said, there's just so much material. I can't cover it all, but I do want to highlight some very, very influential ideas that come out of Weber, and I think they're just as profound now as they were when he wrote them. And so one of the ways that he has really contributed to an ongoing discussion within our societies is on the idea of bureaucracy. And so we live so within this Leviathan that I think many people don't even think about it. So in my classes, I've often said, if you want to know what this looks like, you're probably all too young to experience this, but when you work within a bureaucracy, you'll often get wellness newsletters and things like that from your human resources department. Actually, one of the best ways of looking at it is through the lens of the show The Office, because of the ongoing battle with HR and the boss. But bureaucracy is definitely a structure that we all live in, but at the time that he was writing, this was just beginning to happen. So he writes, obviously 1968 is not when he wrote it, this is when this edition was published. The decisive reason for the advance of bureaucratic organization has always been its purely technical superiority over any other form of organization. The fully developed bureaucratic apparatus compares with other organizations exactly as does a machine with non-mechanical modes of production. So he's directly relating the rise of bureaucracy to these mechanical changes of the Industrial Revolution and so on. And how do you run these huge operations? You have these, you need bureaucracy in order to do it. And so he's not arguing in any way that it's not technically superior. But what he is asking us to do is look at the ways in which it's destructive for human beings. And I think this is a very important point that he's making. There have been many, many critics that have come after Weber. One of the most profound is looking at the ways in which bureaucracy functioned in the Nazi movement. It was a highly bureaucratic government, and the ways in which when individuals are in a bureaucracy, they can kind of just ease themselves out of any kind of moral questions about what they're doing. They're just pushing paper around and stamping things, or now it's on a computer, it doesn't matter, it's the same thing. But what bureaucracy is highly efficient, but what if that efficiency is being tied to something as despicable as a genocide, for instance? So clearly bureaucracy is not good in and of itself, even though there continue to be people who clearly think it is. But any of us who've lived in Canada, we've all had our skirmishes with bureaucracy. So AI is just a new version of it. So you can basically get on the phone and you're talking to a computer, and yes, that's efficient. Absolutely. Does it work? No, it doesn't. Is it enraging? Absolutely. So I think, again, if we sort of imagine Weber looking now, he would say it's just come to its logical kind of conclusion. So, an idea related to this, kind of the way in which bureaucracy controls more and more of our lives in Western countries and increasingly around the world, is Weber's idea of disenchantment, or Ensaubaggerung. And so he argued that science and the Enlightenment had eroded the power of religion. And so I don't think he's saying anything controversial there. We know already from the earlier lectures, and you've living within this, that the Enlightenment and science tend to, at least in the Western world, call religion into question. Now, I always say in my religion courses, this isn't true in many parts of the other parts of the world. So, for instance, I'll just give an example. In India, somebody can be a scientist and an engineer and sees no problem with continuing to be a practicing and believing Hindu. It's just not seen as an either or. But certainly, for some reason in the Western world, this developed partly out of that triumphalism that you had to pick a side. And so the Enlightenment saw itself as replacing the Dark Ages of religion. So according to Weber, this process resulted in what he calls the demystification of the world. And so this idea that if we look at the world and human beings through this lens of the Enlightenment, if we really follow it to its logical end, we have a completely demystified world that's flat and banal and meaningless. Okay, and I think, we don't think about this very often, but that is a logical consequence. If you're going to take religion and spirituality out of the world, you're going to lose things like meaning and if we look at religion, many religions have an element of animism, that the divine is within the natural world, the divine is within art, and so we lose all of that. So Weber's very concerned, and this is why he is called nostalgic sometimes, with these things being lost, because they are, and I agree with him here, so intrinsically human. And so what are we creating here exactly? So within modernity, religious belief is often replaced by reason and rationality. And so this is absolutely true. And certainly this is part of bureaucracy, that things have to run on efficiency, and reason and rationality and human feeling and so on just get sort of generally pushed to the side. So this was seen by Weber as the alienating and undesirable flip side of scientific progress, that the world was rendered predictable and intellectualized. So the way I presented this, for instance, when I teach a course on religion and popular culture, is I pose the question, can we live without enchantment as human beings? Can we just live this completely rational, reasoned existence? There certainly are people who would argue that we can and we should, but I would say I think it's not surprising that as we've seen religious participation dropping in countries like Canada, we've seen an explosion of the genre of fantasy, for instance, both in games and books and movies and so on. So it seems to me that human beings can't, in fact, live this just completely banal, mundane existence. We always are seeking some other dimension. So that dimension has traditionally been filled by religion. So Weber, like Durkheim, he doesn't necessarily say it directly, but he's asking, if we remove this, what replaces it? So I want to turn now to, as I said, probably Weber's most influential work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And so, as I said at the beginning, this book really charts the concept that ideas shape society. It isn't just that economics determines it. And if you recall in that first lecture, there's whole schools of thought, like out of the Scottish Enlightenment, that think it's all about property and all about money. But Weber turns that and says, no, that comes later. It's the ideas that develop. So people tend to fall on one side or the other. I think we just need to engage with this with an open mind and look at his argument. So he's really doing something very interesting here of making the connection between religion, economy, and individual behavior. So the work starts out with this quotation that I have here, and thankfully this is his basic thesis. This isn't always true. The writing in this book is complex, so it's good that he's this is like a kind of précis. So he writes, a glance at the occupational statistics of any country of mixed religious composition brings to light with remarkable frequency a situation which has several times provoked discussion in the Catholic press and literature, the fact that business leaders and owners of capital are overwhelmingly Protestant. Okay, so here we have the way somebody comes up with a groundbreaking idea. So he's looking out at the world around him, he's seeing this fact, and then he's asking the question why. And so, again, this is controversial. I myself have had arguments with people about this thesis. I find his argument extremely convincing, but not everybody does. But again, like Durkheim, he's looking at statistics, but he's using them for analysis. It's not just statistics for their own sake. He's using them to develop an idea that he's going to argue throughout the course of the book and build up over the chapters of the book. So the question then is, why is it that these business leaders and owners, so Germany is essentially, I think it's like half Catholic, half Protestant, but why do we see that the business leaders and owners of capital cluster in the Protestants, in the Protestant population? In this section of the book, he talks about the spirit of capitalism, and he's using that language very precisely. So we tend to think of capitalism as this kind of rational, or at least not religious kind of system, but he's looking at spirit and what role that played in the development of capitalism. Now, he's very clear he doesn't mean there weren't markets and trading and all those things before Protestantism. Clearly there were all around the world. But his argument is this particular type of capitalism comes only out of the Western world and out of the Protestant movement. So he says, it must thus be said that the development of the spirit of capitalism is best understood as part of the development of rationalism as a whole. In the process, Protestantism would only have been considered as far as it formed a stage prior to the development of a purely rationalistic philosophy. So this is one point he's making. It can be looked at this way, that Protestantism in and of itself leads into rationalism, and I think you could totally make that argument. So those of you who, you may have studied religion or just in high school, I'm not sure. The Protestant Reformation is that kind of dispute within Christianity that breaks the Christian churches in Europe into two. And so the Protestants are particularly opposed, as many of you will know, to the Vatican, to the power of the Pope, and so on. But they don't only do that, they really do, you could argue, rationalize the tradition. They remove the saints, they remove the statues in a lot of cases. They're very suspicious of music and art. Depends on the group or the denomination, but we certainly see a stripping down within Protestantism that in many ways could be said to be kind of inching towards rationalism. But he's arguing that, in fact, that's not completely true, that there is a spirit within this, and he says, we are here particularly interested in the origin of precisely the irrational element which lies in this, as in every conception of a calling. Okay, so he's saying it isn't purely, Protestantism was never purely rational, because no religion is rational. It's based in faith and belief and so on. And so he's arguing here that I just want to give an example because I know this can seem a bit abstract. I've often asked this question. Many, many times I've asked this question. With these billionaires that we're constantly hearing about, why do they keep wanting to make more money? It doesn't make any sense. If you want to talk about rationality, you would say, if you're a hedonism and you just want pleasure in life, why wouldn't you just go somewhere and enjoy yourself? Why do you have to keep enriching yourself? So there's a kind of an irrational element we can even see in capitalists all around us, that clearly it's never enough. And to me, that points to something irrational that's driving that person. I'm not saying it's religion, but it's kind of like a religious impulse, because it's the pursuit of money in some ways that's giving meaning to their life. In the next section, Weber starts looking at some key ideas that emerge from the Protestant Reformation. And so these are ideas that are quite different than Catholic theology. So he starts out looking at Luther, who many of you will know is the single most important person in the Protestant Reformation. And so Luther had been a a monk, and he broke away from the Catholic Church. And then all these different kind of Protestant sects developed from there. So Luther in his writings comes up. We have to be careful here because Lutheranism that comes from Luther is in many ways more like Catholicism than the sects that are going to follow. But nonetheless, there's key differences. One of these is Luther's conception of a calling, or Beruf in German. So the effect of the Reformation as compared with the Catholic attitude, the moral emphasis on and religious sanction of organized worldly labor. So this is absolutely key, and this gets us into something very important that is actually remarkably very little discussed in my experience. And I actually had a student write a paper on it in my intro course to the study of religion, and it's the idea of Catholic versus Protestant attitudes to work. Okay, they're very different, and so for the Protestants coming out of Luther's concept, there is a kind of religious sanction to work. So worldly labor and work becomes actually a holy activity. It becomes a religious activity. Okay, and if I just want to pull this out for a minute, and if we look around us, because Ontario is extremely influenced by the Protestant work ethic, we can see that there's a sense for a lot of people that work gives intense meaning to their lives in a pretty much a religious way. And so this comes directly from this style of Protestantism, that your work in the world can be your calling. And you'll hear people talk about that in various jobs. This is my calling. So it has a deep meaning, kind of vocational meaning for them. I'm not saying this only exists in Christianity. I've actually, it to some extent exists in Sikhism in my experience. I've heard many Sikhs say, no matter what my job is, it's, you know, it's kind of like it's a spiritual calling to do good work. So while Luther is central to the Protestant Reformation, it's the theology of Calvinism that is the most influential on the Protestant work ethic as presented by Weber. Okay, so Luther's important. He's demarcating attitudes to work that are very different. And so from what I have gleaned, the traditional Catholic view of work, and now let's be careful here. I am by no means saying Catholics don't work. Obviously they do. But it's more the attitude to work, which is that from a Catholic perspective, work comes after the fall of humanity, after the Garden of Eden. So it's not something particularly good. It's almost a punishment in a sense that we have to earn our living by the sweat of our brows. So it's a very, very different attitude to work. And I'm going to be ending this lecture giving you a very concrete example, but I think you just need to think about Catholic countries like Italy or Spain, and I think you can see very clearly they have a very different attitude to work than, say, people in the Netherlands. So in the next section, Weber looks at the ideas of John Calvin and the groups that develop from what's now called Calvinism. Some of you will have heard of that. And so Calvin was actually born in France, but his ideas were not as influential in France. He was kind of driven out. There were a group of French Calvinists, which you may have heard of, called the Huguenots, but they actually had to flee France. Some went to England, some went to the New World. And so Calvin ends up in Geneva, which was kind of the hotbed of the Protestant Revolution, and tries to create a kind of theocratic state. And there's a number of different Protestant theologians vying for influence, but he is, it's pretty much agreed that he's the most important Protestant theologian of his generation. So there's a lot of talk in Geneva at the time of, you know, can you go bowling on Sunday, and these kind of questions. So Calvin adds in some very, he says it's based on the Bible, but what are really very novel ideas within his theology that we're going to look at. So in Calvin's theology, he accepts those broader concepts of the Protestant Reformation, which is the rejection of the power of the Vatican and of the Pope. There's also the rejection. This is complicated, and this isn't a religion course, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. So if we look at certain forms of Protestantism, they do have some saints, but the Calvinists do not. So there's no saints, there's no crucifix, sort of the crucified Christ on the cross. There's just the image of the cross. He also accepts Luther's concept of justification by faith and the sole authority of Scripture. So what we can see in all forms of Protestantism is this emphasis on the Bible and on individuals reading the Bible. And this in and of itself is revolutionary. So it was never expected, certainly by Catholics, that anyone would have a Bible in their house. First of all, most people couldn't read. Second of all, it would be in Latin. So what we see is that with Protestantism, this is a whole other lecture really, but we can actually come back to it when we look at Marshall McLuhan. So in many ways, the whole revolution within printing impacts the Protestant Reformation. So you probably know that the first thing that was printed by the press in the Western world was the Bible. And so we start to see the Bible coming into the hands of normal people. With Luther, I believe he's the first to translate the Bible into German. And so we increasingly see the Bible by Protestants is being translated into vernacular languages like French and English. And so it becomes very important because the sole authority of the religion, or a lot of the authority of the religion, rests in Scripture. And so this is, you're probably familiar with this idea that where people are constantly going back to Scripture to justify their ideas. So the part that is unusual, and as far as I know doesn't really exist anywhere else, and he's drawing on St. Augustine here, is he developed the idea of the elect. So this is the doctrine of election that states that before the creation of the world, God ordained some for eternal life and passed over others. Now, I have had discussions, it was actually with somebody who was Dutch Reform, about this idea, because as somebody who has studied some theology, this one is mystifying to me. So basically, it's the idea that when you're born, you're already destined for eternal life or not. And so if you are, you're part of the elect. But the complication is you don't know if you're the elect, so you have to act properly, because obviously the idea would be then what's my impetus to be a good person if I'm going to hell anyway, or I don't have eternal life. So the idea, I'm not pretending to agree with this, but it's the idea that you should act like you're part of the elect in order to I'm not even sure why you're supposed to act like the elect, but that's the idea. That's your impetus. So Calvinism was most influential in Scotland, so it becomes what we now call Presbyterians, in the Puritan movement that deeply influenced English and American culture. So many of you, of course, will know that those Puritan sects came over on the Mayflower and founded colonies. And so the Puritan movement was very influential in the United States, much, much less than it was in Canada, for instance. And this has had a profound influence. And one of the examples I always give of this difference is, you're probably aware, in American politics, there's always this obsession with the sex lives of politicians, where in Canada, I think we're like, we don't want to know about that. That's their business, right? So that's that Puritan impulse of that somehow sexuality is part of your public life and you have to be kind of moral in all these areas. And so it deeply influenced England, but not as much as America. It was extremely influential in the United States and also in the Netherlands, where it's called Dutch, or at least in Canada, it's called Dutch Reform. There's actually a very large Dutch population in Canada who are Dutch Reform. Now, there are Dutch Catholics as well, but there's a large number of Dutch Reform people, both in Canada and in Holland. So in the next section, Weber refers to the practical ethics of the ascetic branches of Protestantism. And so these forms influenced by Calvinism include Pietism, Methodism, and Baptist sects. And I find this part really interesting, and I think this is where you can really see the personal influencing the work of Weber, that coming from this background himself through his mother's religion, that he has felt the influence of this, perhaps that extreme perfectionism that's kind of within this style of Protestantism. And so he says, in its extreme inhumanity, this doctrine must above all have one consequence for the life of a generation which surrendered to its magnificent consistency. This was a feeling of unprecedented inner loneliness. So that just, to me, rings as something very personal that perhaps was contributing to his issues that he was struggling with. And so this also kind of chimes with Durkheim, this idea that he saw that Protestants had a higher suicide rate, if you recall from the other lecture, that if I have this sense that maybe I'm not one of the elect and that God's not going to help me, that's going to be as lonely as it gets. So if I look, for instance, at the Catholic approach or other forms of Protestantism, the concept is always that you're never alone, God is with you. So this takes away that feeling, and so I think he's absolutely right that this is a highly individualistic approach theologically, and I think you can see that very clearly again in American culture, that emphasis on the individual, and too bad if it's hard. You're on your own kind of thing. Now, obviously, there are other concepts playing into this, such as social Darwinism, which was also very influential in the United States in a way that it just never was in Canada. So that idea of survival of the fittest. But I think that people found that idea familiar because they already had this concept coming out of Calvinism. On the other hand, it forms one of the roots of that disillusioned and pessimistically inclined individualism. So here he's critiquing that. So this idea that this form of theology creates an extreme form of individualism, and certainly if we take a Durkheimian view of it, this can be potentially very problematic for the individual, because sort of everything is on them. There's no concept here of community helping you or God helping you. It's sort of you're on your own. In this next section, Weber makes his central point in asceticism and the spirit of capitalism. And so just to pause for a moment, I want to talk about asceticism. Be careful here, it's not aesthetics, that's a different word, both Greek, so it's confusing. But asceticism refers to those practices within religion, such things like fasting, giving up worldly possessions, and so on. And so if we look at the Catholic version, chastity, obedience, right? These kind of concepts. So they remain within Christianity, but they take on a very different tone in the Protestant case, in particular in the Calvinist case. That asceticism that would have been practiced by monks and nuns in particular, where they don't own private property, they live in community, they pray and they fast. This is now taken out into the world because, as you probably know, within Protestant cultures, they just often destroyed the monasteries. In many of those countries they've come back, but they destroyed the monasteries, they liquidated them. And so it's not that asceticism just disappeared, it's that it kind of moves into the mainstream culture. And I've often made this argument when I look at some of these fad diets and practices that you see, that I've made the joke that they would make a medieval monk blanch in horror, the way that people put themselves through these triathlons and harsh diets and waking up at 4 in the morning and dunking their head in ice. And these are all very ascetic practices. And it is fascinating to think about the ways these are ghosts of religion that are living in our culture in a kind of unconscious way. So he goes on to say, the Puritan wanted to work in a calling, for when asceticism was carried out of monastic cells into everyday life and began to dominate worldly morality, it did its part in building the tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order. So you can see the argument he's making here, that it is in fact these ideas that create our modern economic order, not the other way around, which would be a more Marxist view. And obviously we're going to be looking at Marx separately. But from a Marxist perspective, it's the economic order that creates religion, and it's a kind of delusion that people have. This is very different what Weber is saying here, and you can see why Marxists often don't like Weber. This order is now bound to the technical and economic conditions of machine production, which totally determines the life of all individuals who are born into this mechanism. So this is also very important, that this order has become so overarching that we all just live within it. Now, obviously, there are individuals who maybe don't, but the vast majority of us were part of it. We have social insurance numbers. We're part of this vast machinery. And we're part of the overall economy. And this is something I do want to talk about in this course of resistance to this. There's been resistance to this all the way along. I think I mentioned the Romantic movement and kind of the heirs to the Romantic movement in our lifetime. So people who go and want to live in a van and travel the world and be nomads, digital nomads, this kind of thing, I feel is a reaction against this. And we can talk about that more as we go along. But without a doubt, for the vast majority of us, we live within this, whether we want to or not. So now we come to another very influential idea that comes out of this whole system that's developed as a result of this type of Protestantism, which is the creation of what Weber calls the iron cage. So this concept is beloved by grad students everywhere. So the idea, in German, it actually apparently translates out as to kind of like a hard shell around us. And so the way that bureaucracy and the machinery of capitalism is kind of holding us all within it, whether we want to be there or not. So you can see, again, why he was being called nostalgic. So the idea that he is kind of harking back to a time before we all lived in, I think it's pretty clear he doesn't think living in an iron cage is something that you want to be doing. So he says, no one knows who will live in this cage in the future, or whether at the end of this tremendous development entirely new prophets will arise, and there will be a great rebirth of old ideas and ideals. And so I think you can see why he tends to be beloved by religious studies scholars, not all of them, but a lot, that he's basically, you can use these ideas and apply them to what's going on right now. So are we living through rebirth, or are we seeing the death of religion? I think it could be argued both, actually. For significant parts of the population, they just don't believe in anything, but we certainly see very vital, influential movements such as Pentecostal Christianity, evangelical Christianity gaining in adherence. So this is an ongoing question, depends on the country, depends on the culture. But he was musing at this time what it was going to look like. So he's basically saying perhaps we're just all going to end up in this iron cage and we're going to be trapped on, with Bell Canada online forever, just listening to the tinny music, waiting to talk to a human. Or maybe there will be people that revivify religion or want to return back to ideas that existed before the Industrial Revolution and this style of Protestantism. So he's basically saying he doesn't know, but this is what he sees right now, that this is the direction society is moving in, and I think he was absolutely right. So like Durkheim, he could see logically where these concepts were leading. And certainly in case of both of them, they both saw the First World War, so they had no reason to be optimistic about that. So if we take that bureaucracy and organization and efficiency and we apply it to war, we're looking at something that's very terrible, and we all know that in this day and age. For the last stage of this cultural development, it might truly be said, a specialist without spirit, sensualist without heart. This nullity imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved. So here he's being directly critical. So I find it interesting. He's prophesizing here the idea of the specialist, and Lord knows we're living in that world where specialization is at the heart of many. We can see it in medicine. And so this idea that we become specialists, but there's no spirit in it, there's no meaning in it, it's just purely efficiency. And I always think somebody wrote on this as well, on kind of hack culture on YouTube and online, of becoming ultimately efficient. It's very interesting, and I think you could totally do an analysis of that kind of life hacks and say you're just voluntarily closing the door on the iron cage when you do that, when you make your whole life. I'm not saying I'm a list maker, that's fine, but that idea that everything's got to be optimized, everything's got to be efficiency, that is absolutely the logic of the iron cage. And so you can see the genius of Weber is he realizes how this is going to come into influencing actual individuals and how they're living their lives day to day if you see yourself that way. And this is also highly dangerous. So there's a section in the book on the Third Reich that was very chilling when I read it. The idea of people like Speer, who were, engineers and architects, and who served the Nazis before and during World War II, that there was absolutely no sense of morality or meaning or beauty or anything. It was just this idea of efficiency. And so he's saying these are kind of what can happen when we have specialists without spirit, or I would say without heart. So he says sensualists without heart. So kind of where sexuality becomes completely divorced from meaning or feeling. This nullity imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved. And so he's touching on something here that I have noticed also, and I touched on this at the beginning, was that idea of the triumphalism of this way of looking at the world. And so I'll just give an example from my own life. Many years ago, when I was a waitress, we had a manager come in who had I assume he had just done some kind of a course in something he was studying on how to handle employees. So he brought in this system where he was going to time us and how long it took us to get from, I don't know, it was like when you take the plate of food to the table, and he would time us and we had to become more efficient. And so I think you can understand from my attitude, I didn't take that very well. I didn't last very long in that particular job, and I actually don't think they maintained that system because it was ridiculous. But this idea very much coming out of management studies, that you can, optimize timing. I'll give another example, more current, of Amazon. You've probably heard that in Amazon warehouses, they were putting sort of bracelets on people that were timing how long they took in the bathroom and things like that. So pretty horrifying, right? Just totally inhumane treatment of people. And so if you want to talk about alienated labor, that's going to be it. But at the same time, and we certainly see this with the Silicon Valley folks, this sense that, this is the peak of civilization to be in this iron cage. Okay, I'm going to end here with a concrete example because I do think that can be helpful when we're looking at these complex ideas. So how do we apply it as a way to understand it? And so usually I do this by comparing Toronto and Montreal. And this is coming on the heels of just after the snowstorm in Southern Ontario. There was somebody in Montreal making fun of Toronto because it was many years ago now when Toronto called in the army during a snowfall. So the Toronto-Montreal rivalry is very old and ongoing. But nonetheless, many people from Toronto go to Montreal specifically to relax. So I just want to talk about this. So people don't think about why is it relaxing to go to Montreal. So I'll just give an example. I go to Montreal a lot. I was walking by a shop and there was a coat. It was a man's coat, winter coat, bright orange. And I was like, I would never see this coat in Ontario. So this difference in culture even influences use of color, the way people dress. We know that the fashion center of Canada, the making of clothes continues to be Montreal. And so my argument here is that even though Quebec, obviously, we know that it's more and more rejecting religion, that Catholic culture overlays Quebec culture in general. So again, we need to be careful here. It doesn't matter if your own background is Protestant or Catholic. It's the ways in which the culture has been influenced by those religions and shaped its economics and views of life. So I certainly feel this, and I feel this whenever I go to a Catholic majority country, whether it's France or Spain or Italy. Immediately, you can feel that work isn't as important. Now, again, I'm not saying that people don't work hard in those countries, but it's not that it's central. Whereas in Ontario, certainly Southern Ontario, it's central. And people always say, oh, it's because the money is so tight. No, this existed long before our housing crisis or other problems we're facing. And in many ways may have created it. And so I'll just give an example. I have a colleague that's from Montreal, and when he moved to North Bay, he said to me, why is the first thing somebody asks me what I do for a living? And I kind of stared at him because that's a question I would ask, being from Ontario. And then I thought about it and I thought, that's true. Why would you ask that? Why would that be the first thing? Like, that's the most important thing about that person. So I'm building up my argument here that certainly Southern Ontario, it's all about work. And the joke about Toronto is that everybody says, thank God it's Monday, not thank God it's Friday. Because they're like, what do I do with the weekend? I'll just work through the weekend. And so, again, there are many people who argue with this, but I think it's, for me, I've lived it. It's just so clear in the difference in the culture. The attitude to work is just so different. And I don't think it's surprising, given that Southern Ontario has been so shaped by Protestant, particularly Methodist ideas about work and being useful and so on. Certainly in our time period now, a lot of that has been removed from religion, and so we get is just people working without any real sense of why they're doing it. But I think, again, obviously you will make up your own mind about if you find Weber's arguments convincing, just as we talked about it with Durkheim. But when you read through the book, he makes a very convincing argument for the ways in which these types of Protestant have created the kind of modern Western world.